Spring used to mean more than flowers. It meant bright, fresh dishes on every table. Today, we're dusting off a few forgotten favorites from a time when flavor followed the season. Rhubarb Fool. Now there's a name you don't hear tossed around much anymore. Not since folks traded in their mixing bowls for microwaves. Back when I was a young fella, you'd see that dish pop up on every Formica countertop from coast to coast, right when spring was starting to stretch its legs. It's a simple, humble dessert, older than the hills, really. Goes back to England originally, but American homemakers made it their own, especially up in the Northeast and Midwest, where rhubarb grew like weeds once the frost let go. See, Rhubarb Fool is what you'd call a custard and compote affair. The fool part comes from the Old English term for a pureed fruit mixed with cream. Unless you had it on April Fool's Day, there was nothing foolish about it. Come springtime, when rhubarb's tart red stalks were finally ready to cut from the backyard patch, housewives would stew the chopped stalks down with enough sugar to take off the pucker. That tartness was the kicker, made it stand out from the usual puddings and pies. Once the rhubarb was soft and bright pink, you'd let it cool, then fold it gently into whipped cream or a custard base if you had extra eggs to spare from the hens. Some moms added a splash of vanilla or even orange zest, depending on what she had lying around. Served chilled in parfait glasses or little dessert bowls, it looked as fresh as spring itself. Rhubarb Fool was light as a cloud and pleasantly sweet, with that zingy bite from the rhubarb to keep your palate on its toes. This dessert didn't sit heavy, perfect, after a Sunday ham or a fried chicken supper when the windows were open and the screens were letting in the evening breeze. Nowadays you don't see Rhubarb Fool much. Too plain Jane for the Instagram crowd, I suppose. But back in the day, it was a sign that the gray months were behind us and something fresh was on the table. Pineapple glazed ham was the crown jewel of any respectable spring spread, especially around Easter time. Back in the 50s and 60s, when everything was canned, molded, or jellied, a ham with pineapple rings and maraschino cherries was about as close to high holiday dining as most working folks got. You'd walk into Grandma's dining room and smell that sweet, smoky perfume before you even saw the thing. Ham was a springtime tradition going way back to the old country. In the days before refrigeration, pigs were butchered in the fall, and by the time spring rolled around, the hams that had been curing all winter were finally ready to eat. So come Easter, you'd trot out the best ham you had, and by the 20th century, Americans gave it a little tropical twist that looked good in color photos and magazine ads. To make a pineapple glazed ham, you'd start with a bone-in ham. Spiral cut was best. Once you have it, put it aside for a moment and put some love into the glaze. Brown sugar, mustard, a splash of vinegar or clove-studded pineapple juice, all cooked down until it was syrupy. Some folks added a bit of ginger or even a glug of bourbon, depending on what flavors you want to pop out of the meat. Once that glaze was bubbling, you'd score the ham in a crosshatch, stud it with cloves, and start brushing the sweet glaze on as it baked. Once it's covered in syrupy goodness, it's time to decorate. Pin a few canned pineapple rings to the ham with toothpicks and maraschino cherries in the center of each one, like little red bullseyes. If it looks like something out of a Better Homes and Gardens cookbook, you did it right. This thing was salty, sweet, tangy, with that sticky crust on the outside and juicy meat inside. The pineapple would caramelize around the edges, and the glaze would drip down into the fat cracks, giving every bite a little pop of sunshine. Try making it yourself. Goldenrod eggs is a breakfast dish that's all but vanished from American tables. It's a crying shame if you ask me. Used to be a real springtime staple back when folks knew their way around a stove and didn't mind using a little elbow grease to whip up something special. You'd mostly find it in the Midwest and the South, where chickens started laying again in earnest once the days got longer, and there were plenty of fresh eggs to go around. Goldenrod eggs were the kind of thing my ma would make on Easter morning, or maybe a Saturday in April when the daffodils were just poking their heads up. The name comes from the look of the finished dish, like that wild goldenrod plant you'd see along country roads. Yellow and white and cheerful as all get out. Here's how it worked. You'd start by hard boiling a mess of eggs. How many depended on how big a crowd you were feeding. Once they were cooled and peeled, you'd separate the whites from the yolks. The whites got chopped fine, while the yolks were pushed through a sieve or crumbled up with a fork till they looked like yellow dust. Then you'd whip up a creamy white sauce, what they called a basic bechamel in fancy cookbooks. Butter, flour, milk, salt, pepper, just the bare bones. But if you made it right, it came out smooth as silk. You'd stir the chopped egg whites into that sauce and spoon it hot over slices of buttered toast. Then you'd sprinkle those golden yolk crumbs right on top, like sunshine on a plate. Goldenrod eggs came out mild and comforting, like a warm egg salad on toast, but smoother and gentler. The whites gave it a little bite, the sauce made it rich, and those yolks gave a savory burst right at the end. Kids liked it because it was creamy. Moms liked it because it used up leftovers and filled her family up right. Plus, it looked pretty. Fancy without being fussy. Lamb in springtime made perfect sense. The meat was young, tender. Spring lamb, they called it, born in winter, ready for butchering by the time the first green shoots started poking through. You'd get these little rib or loin chops, marbled just enough, and you'd either grill them or pan-sear them with salt and pepper and a dab of garlic or rosemary. A quick sear and that fat would crisp up around the edges. Smelled like heaven and tasted even better. But what really made the dish sing was that mint jelly. Now don't wrinkle your nose. It ain't the same as spreading jam on toast. This was bright green, glossy stuff, kept in a squat jar in the fridge door. Sweet, sharp, a little tangy. It cut through the richness of the lamb like a warm knife through butter. But out of all the flavor combinations out there, why mint with lamb? It's an old English tradition, you see. Back when lamb was a staple and mint grew like weeds near the kitchen door, Americans took a shine to it post-war, when cookbooks started pushing it to modern housewives as a special meal. Some people made the jelly from scratch, using fresh mint, sugar, vinegar, and gelatin. But most folk just bought it from the store and called it a day. Plop a spoonful right next to the chops. Didn't matter if it slid into your green beans or mashed taters. That was half the charm. Lamb chops with mint jelly gave you a fine balance of savory, juicy meat with that cool, herbal sweetness from the jelly. You don't see much of it anymore. Folks nowadays get spooked by the gaminess, and most wouldn't know what to do with a jar of mint jelly if it fell off the shelf and hit them in the toe. But back in the day, this was a dish you looked forward to. Bunny salad is one of those vintage recipes that has the kind of whimsical charm that's perfect for Easter luncheons. You didn't need fancy ingredients to make something fun and festive. All you needed was a little imagination and what you had in the pantry. To make this salad, you start with a base of crisp, fresh lettuce leaves laid out on a plate like a soft green blanket. The main ingredient for this salad was pear halves. Have them chilled and ready to go. They're smooth, pale flesh, perfect for creating the bunny shape. You place each pear, cut side down, with the narrow end pointing toward the center of the plate. It gives the pears the look of bunny faces, and you're halfway there. Now comes the fun part, decorating. For the eyes, you place a couple of raisins on each pear half, one for each eye. They add a little sweetness and a dark contrast to the soft, pale pears. The cinnamon candy comes next for the nose. You pop one right in the center, giving it that bright red pop that really makes the bunny come to life. Those red candies not only add a touch of sweetness, but a bit of spice that's nice with the fruit. Then, for the ears, this is where the blanched almonds come in. They're positioned on top, one on each side, pointing outward like the floppy bunny ears of your dreams. And finally, the tail. A simple spoonful of cottage cheese is shaped into a fluffy white tail, sitting right at the back of the pear bunny, completing the look. The whole thing ends up being a playful, colorful salad with a mix of textures. The crisp lettuce, the soft pears, the chewiness of the raisins, and the little crunch from the almonds. The cottage cheese tail adds a creamy contrast, and altogether, it's a surprisingly delightful treat. Sweet and a little tangy, but mostly fun. Kids used to chuckle when they saw it, and then they'd dive right in. Who wouldn't want to eat a cute little bunny made out of fruit, candy, and cottage cheese? If you wanted the real thing, though, you might want to check out this next dish. This here's a springtime favorite. Back when folks still raised their own meat, or at least had a neighbor who did. Nowadays, you mention rabbit, and kids look at you like you suggested cooking the family dog. But back then, rabbits were fair game, cheap, easy to raise, and a lot more common than store-bought chicken if you were living out past the edge of town. Spring was prime time for rabbit. After the long winter, when the pantry was down to beans and dried-out potatoes, young rabbits started to show up again. A lot of people had a small hutch in the backyard with a couple of does who'd been busy while the snow was still falling. By March or April, you had tender young meat that didn't need hours to cook like an old rooster would. Now, the stew itself was simple, humble, but built to comfort. You'd joint the rabbit, dredge it in seasoned flour, and brown it up in a Dutch oven with some fat. Lard if you were old school, butter if the cow had calved. Then you'd throw in onions, garlic, and a splash of stock or water. Maybe a little white wine if you had a bottle open from Sunday dinner. The root vegetables were the backbone of this dish. Carrots, parsnips, a turnip or two, and always potatoes. Nothing fancy, just whatever had wintered well in the root cellar. Some folks added herbs, thyme, bay leaf, parsley, and toward the end, maybe some early spring greens like sorrel or dandelion to brighten it up a bit. You'd let it all simmer low and slow until the rabbit meat was falling off the bone, and the broth was rich and thick with the starch from the potatoes. Serve it in a deep bowl with a slice of crusty bread or a biscuit for sopping. Rabbit stew was earthy and savory, with a bit of sweetness from the carrots and a faint wildness from the rabbit meat. Not gamey if it was young, just clean, like the woods after a rain. Unfortunately, like with lamb chops, too many folks are squeamish about the idea, and supermarkets don't stock it like they do chicken. But if you ever get your hands on a fresh fryer rabbit and a bag of honest vegetables, make this dish and taste a bit of how spring used to feel. Strawberry shortcake showed up on tables across America every spring when the first real strawberries hit the stands. Back then, strawberries weren't around all year like they are now. You had a short window, maybe 4-5 good weeks if the weather was good, where you could pick them fresh. Folks would head out early in the morning to pick them by hand, baskets full, sun on their backs, kids sneaking more into their mouths than the pail. And once you had a bowl full of those ruby red berries, there was really only one thing to do: make shortcake. Now, the old-timers like to keep the cake part of strawberry shortcake biscuity, slightly sweet, golden on the outside, tender on the inside, like a cross between a scone and a drop biscuit. You'd split it open warm, spoon over juicy, sliced strawberries that had been macerated with a bit of sugar until they made their own syrup, and then top it off with real whipped cream. When you bit into it, you got the tart bite of the berry, the crumbly richness of the biscuit, and that cool, airy cream all at once. It tasted like sunshine and Sunday afternoons, which was probably why it was a point of pride for mothers and grandmothers all over America. It's a taste you just can't get from the boxed mixes and frozen berries of today. Spring vegetable casserole showed up on every table from Indiana to the Carolinas, right when the dogwoods started to bloom. This dish was all about celebrating the garden's first bounty, but doing it in a way that fit right into the American casserole tradition. Creamy, cheesy, and baked until bubbly and golden around the edges. Come spring, folks were itching to use whatever fresh veggies they could pull out of the dirt. You'd start seeing asparagus, baby carrots, snap peas, scallions, maybe some tender young zucchini or yellow squash if you were lucky. This casserole was born out of necessity and know-how. Take a little of this, a little of that, and stretch it into something that could feed a crowd and still warm your bones after a crisp spring breeze. Lucky for you, making it wasn't hard. You'd blanch the vegetables just to get the bite out. You still wanted them to have a little snap though, not turn to mush. Then you'd make yourself a cream sauce. Start with butter, whisk in some flour, add milk or half and half, and season it up with salt, pepper, and a pinch of nutmeg or garlic powder. If you had cheese, and back then, Velveeta or mild cheddar were the go-to, you'd melt a handful in right there. Then all the veggies went into a buttered casserole dish, got doused in that sauce and topped off with crushed crackers, buttered breadcrumbs, or sometimes even cornflakes. Into the oven it went until it was bubbling like a spring creek. When it was done, it was creamy, rich, but still light thanks to all those fresh vegetables. You'd get a little sweetness from the carrots, a mild bitterness from the asparagus, and the zip of green onion or leek all wrapped up in that warm, melty sauce. It was comforting, and it made you feel like winter was finally behind you and things were about to grow again. What springtime meal do you remember from your childhood? Comment down below and you just might see it in the next video. Now, let's move on to the next one. Most folks these days only think of chicken and dumplings as a heavy, creamy, cold weather stew. But come spring, you'd see a different kind of pot simmering on the stove. Brighter, fresher, with all the good green stuff coming back to life. If you grew up in the countryside, you didn't waste what was coming out of the ground, and spring meant peas, young carrots, green beans, and especially asparagus if you were lucky enough to have a patch in your backyard. So, when Grandma made chicken and dumplings this time of year, she'd use up whatever fresh vegetables were poking out of the soil, or whatever she could get from the roadside stand. And since chickens were laying again and hens that didn't produce well were culled, you usually had a bird or two to stew. The base of this dish started the same as always. Boil up that chicken with some onions, celery, and a bay leaf or two, skim off the scum. Then pick the meat off the bones. But instead of heavy cream, you'd use the broth just as it was. Just thicken it a touch with a roux or flour slurry. Then in went the spring vegetables, sliced carrots, green peas, fresh herbs like tarragon or parsley, even ramps or spring onions if you were in the Appalachian foothills or somewhere rustic like that. The dumplings weren't your big fluffy biscuit types like in winter, more like tender drop dumplings made from flour, egg, milk, baking powder, and a dab of melted butter. You'd plop them by spoonfuls right into the bubbling pot, cover it up, and don't peek, for the love of Pete, or they'd go dense on you. The end result was a dish that tasted like the season itself. Savory chicken, light broth, and dumplings that soaked up the flavor like a biscuit in a rainstorm. And the vegetables popped with sweetness and color, a far cry from the canned mush you saw later in the year. I used to love eating it with a hunk of cornbread on a breezy porch, getting the most out of the spring weather. Every part of this dish came fresh from the garden. In case you were wondering, new potatoes meant the young ones, dug early, thin-skinned and tender, and no bigger than a hen's egg. You'd pull them up while the ground was still a little soft, maybe late April or early May if the weather had been kind. No need to peel them. Just a good scrub under the pump and they were ready to go. And the peas were sweet as candy when they were fresh off the vine. Still snappy, not the mushy kind folks now only know from a can. Getting quality potatoes and peas were a must. But the entire meal fell apart if you didn't get the cream sauce right. You didn't want anything too complicated, just butter, a little flour to make a roux, then some fresh milk or cream, a touch of salt and cracked pepper. You'd boil the potatoes first, then toss in the peas near the end so they stayed bright green. Drain them, mix them in the sauce, and you had a side dish that could just about steal the show despite its simplicity. You wouldn't believe the taste you got out of just a few ingredients. It was soft and mellow, a little sweet from the peas, buttery from the sauce, and earthy from those potatoes. It was what I'd call gentle food. At the spring dinner table, it would sit alongside ham, fried chicken, or pork chops, or sometimes just got served up all on its own, with some cornbread to clean up the sauce. Oh boy, do I love me some coconut cream pie! This was one of my favorite springtime desserts. A mile-high meringue with toasted coconut flakes catching the light like it was wearing jewelry. Coconut cream pie found its footing around the 1950s when coconut, still considered a bit exotic, became more widely available thanks to better shipping and canned goods. It was especially popular in spring because it felt light, tropical, and just different enough from the heavy pies of winter. The base was a good old-fashioned short crust pie shell, flaky, buttery, blind-baked, so it wouldn't get soggy under the filling. The filling was a rich, stovetop custard made from egg yolks, sugar, milk or half and half, and cornstarch to thicken it right. You'd stir it low and slow till it bubbled thick like pudding, then fold in a generous handful of shredded coconut. Sweetened or fresh if you could get it, a dash of vanilla and a splash of coconut extract if you wanted to go full tiki bar. Now, you could stop right there and top it with whipped cream. But most folks back then went for a meringue crown. Egg whites whipped stiff with sugar and baked until just golden on top. Last step was toasted coconut flakes sprinkled like confetti. Some folks would even toast them in a dry skillet first to get them extra nutty. Flavor-wise, it was smooth and dreamy, sweet but not cloying. You got the coolness of the custard, the crunch of the toasted coconut, the contrast of the buttery crust, and the light kiss of meringue on top. It tasted like Sunday dresses and pastel tablecloths. During springtime, it doesn't get any better than that. That is, until you're served this next dish. Chicken a la king, they say, was whipped up by a hotel chef at Brighton Beach Hotel in New York around the turn of the century, in honor of the hotel owner, E. Clark King II. And by the time spring rolled around, it was one of those creamy comfort foods that popped up in cookbooks with all kinds of variations, as a clever way to use up leftover roast chicken from Sunday dinner. What you got was a rich, velvety chicken stew, heavy cream or milk, butter, flour to thicken it, and a healthy handful of diced bell peppers, mushrooms, sometimes pimentos if you had them sitting in a jar. You'd saute the vegetables, stir in the flour, make a white roux, then add the dairy and cook it down until it turned smooth as silk. Then in went the shredded or cubed chicken, light meat, dark meat, whatever you had. Some folks added a splash of sherry for class, others didn't bother. Salt, pepper, maybe a pinch of paprika, and there you had it. But pay close attention to how you served it. It wasn't just dumped in a bowl, no sir. It was ladled over toast points, biscuits, puff pastry shells, or rice, depending on how fancy you wanted to get. And in springtime, when hens were laying again and cream was fresh, folks felt flush enough to go the extra mile. Chicken a la king was rich and savory, creamy with just enough bite from the peppers, And that soft chicken made the whole dish feel more expensive than it actually was. It stuck to your ribs, but it didn't sit too heavy. A perfect transition meal out of winter into those gentler, longer spring days. Hardly see it anymore unless someone's digging through grandma's recipe box or flipping through a 1950s church cookbook. But back then, chicken a la king made you eat like royalty even if your castle had linoleum floors. Folks these days don't get all that excited about rhubarb. But back in my day, that was spring's first fruit, even though it's technically a vegetable. And it was treated like pure gold. Rhubarb crunch, sometimes called rhubarb crumble, depending on which aunt made it, was a no-fuss, Sunday supper kind of dessert. Didn't need a pie crust, didn't need fancy equipment, just a big baking dish and a wooden spoon. The filling was just chopped rhubarb mixed with a bit of sugar and a spoonful of flour to soak up the juice once it got bubbling. Some folks added strawberries if they were in season, but purists loved letting that tartness sing. The topping was where the crunch part came in, a buttery blend of oats, brown sugar, flour, and cinnamon, mashed together with your hands until crumbly. You'd sprinkle it thick over the rhubarb and bake the whole thing until the top turned golden brown, and the fruit was bubbling up around the edges like lava from a sweet little volcano. Rhubarb crunch was as tangy as a cheek slap and sweet as a kiss. That rhubarb gave it a sharp citrusy bite that cut through the richness of the brown sugar topping. Best served warm, with a scoop of vanilla ice cream or a dollop of whipped cream straight from the can. Rhubarb was popular back then, partly because it grew like a weed once it took root, and it came in before most fruit. You didn't need to buy it. Most people had a neighbor or uncle with too much of it, practically begging folks to take some off their hands. Hey, if it's free, it's for me. Asparagus was one of the first fresh veggies to pop up in the spring, especially if you lived in the Midwest or parts of the South. You'd see folks pulling bunches from roadside stands or snipping it fresh from their own patch. Those spears were young, tender, and ripe for cooking. Outside of spring season, it was too rubbery. To make it right, you'd trim the woody ends off and either steam or boil the asparagus until it was tender, yet still had a little snap to it. You didn't want it to go limp and sad. Then came the hollandaise sauce, a real test of a home cook's mettle, made from egg yolks, melted butter, a splash of lemon juice, and a whisper of cayenne. You had to whisk it over gentle heat, no shortcuts, or you'd scramble the eggs and wind up with a curdled mess. But when it came out right, it was smooth as silk and rich as a banker's wallet. The flavor pairing was something else. The asparagus had that grassy, earthy brightness, and the hollandaise brought this creamy, tangy richness that wrapped around every bite like a warm coat. Simple, elegant, and satisfying. Folks would serve it as a side for Easter ham or even as a starter if they wanted to impress their in-laws. Rabbit pot pie takes me right back to the old farmhouse kitchen. You don't see this one much anymore, but back in the day, especially in rural America, it was a springtime regular, and not just because it tasted good. It was practical, it was hearty, and it used what was on hand. In the early spring, before the garden was really churning out produce, you'd have young rabbits ready to harvest. They were tender, lean, and perfect for slow cooking. Rabbit was considered a respectable meat, especially before chicken became cheap and factory farmed. And when money was tight, rabbit was often Sunday dinner, dressed up in a crust. The meat had to be stewed first, low and slow with some onion, garlic, and a bay leaf, until it was tender enough to fall off the bone. It's a bit like chicken, but with a richer, earthier flavor. Kind of what chicken used to taste like before they bred all the flavor out of it. Then you'd toss that meat with a creamy sauce made from the stewing broth, thickened up with flour and butter, a splash of milk or cream, and seasoned just right. Into that would go your spring vegetables. baby carrots, new potatoes, peas, and a little spring onion if you had some fresh from the garden. The whole thing got poured into a baking dish and topped with a flaky pastry crust. Sometimes homemade, sometimes just biscuit dough patted thin if you were short on time. You'd bake it until the crust was golden brown and the filling was bubbling like a hot spring. The crust soaked up that rabbit gravy like a sponge, and the vegetables still had a bit of bite. It was rich but not heavy, rustic but refined in its own country way. It was the kind of dish you served with quiet pride, because you raised or caught the rabbit yourself. And that pie fed a whole family. Back in the 30s through the 60s, you'd find rabbit pot pie in more American kitchens than you'd think, especially when meat was scarce after a long winter. Now that we've got enough recipes to last us until summer, tell me, which forgotten spring foods will you be bringing back? Let me know in the comments. And for more videos like this one, please check out Memory Manor and hit that subscribe button while you're at it. Thanks for dropping by.